Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. There's much left over there for the luncheon materials. And please, go back, get seconds. I know we have lots of students here. I was once a graduate student, so I know exactly how that is. So please help yourself. We don't want to waste any resources. I'm Paula Lutz. I'm the Dean of Arts and Sciences, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this luncheon on behalf of the Center for Global Studies and the College of Arts and Sciences. We're here in particular to highlight the partnership between the Center for Global Studies and the Senator Malcolm Wallop Fund for Conversations on Democracy. It's a fund that's housed at the American Heritage Center and the College of Arts and Sciences. The fund honors the work of the late Senator Malcolm Wallop and was created by former Wallop staffers and supporters. We are bringing in Mr. Rasmussen, who is the former Prime Minister of Denmark and NATO Secretary General, as a guest of the Wallop Fund and the College of Arts and Sciences and the Center, and you'll get to meet him a little later this afternoon. We certainly look forward to his lecture on the future of transatlantic relations. But now we're going to hear from the Wallop Fellows, both students and faculty, about their work in service of conversations on democracy around the globe. To do that, I'll introduce Stephanie Anderson, Director of the School of Politics, Public Affairs, and International Studies here at UW.
I just want to thank you all here today, and I have just a very brief introduction. Our two Wallop Faculty Fellows are Dr. Nevin Aiken and Dr. Torsten Janus. So Associate Professor Nevin Aiken is in the school. He's a professor of political science in the School of Politics, Public Affairs, and International Studies. His work is focused on injustices of the past, socioeconomic deprivation, and intercommunal reconciliation in Northern Ireland. And he spent this summer up in Queen's College, Belfast, and we'll be talking about that in just a few moments. I'd also like to introduce Associate Professor of Economics, Torsten Janus, and his research was on economic shocks and political transitions, and he's returned from a sabbatical, and he'll be giving us a little bit about that. First, can we hear from Dr. Aiken?
So thank you all. Lovely to see you all today, this afternoon, on this bright and sunny day, the last day of spring, perhaps. My name is Nevin Aiken, and as Dr. Anderson mentioned, I am an associate professor in political science in the new School of Politics, Public Affairs, and International Studies. And as she mentioned, the background where I teach in research, where a lot of the students actually have had classes with me that are sitting around here, is in the area broadly of international peace and conflict, human rights, and also kind of the more specific subfield of transitional justice. As Dr. Anderson mentioned, how do societies try to reckon with past human rights abuses, legacies of past human rights abuses, so they can move forward towards reconciliation, sustainable peace, and also stable democracy, right? Very much some of the things that are of interest to Senator Wallop as well, and the Wallop Fund. And with the support of my Wallop Faculty Fellowship, as Dr. Anderson mentioned, I got a chance to travel to Northern Ireland this past summer for about 3 months, so between May and August of 2017. And while I was there, I was able to take on a visiting research fellow position with the Senator George Mitchell Institute, another very important U.S. senator, for peace, security, and justice. And I was doing lots and lots of stuff while I was there. One of the things that I was doing very near and dear to my heart was laying the groundwork for some new study abroad opportunities between the University of Wyoming and Queen's University Belfast, setting the ground for student and faculty exchange links between the two schools. And actually, I was just meeting with the Global Engagement Office today, the Study Abroad Office, and we are setting up a new faculty-led study abroad trip for this coming summer, which students are going to be hearing all about. With the Mitchell Institute's prestigious International Summer School on Conflict Transformation and Social Justice. So University of Wyoming students for the first time will have the chance to go and take part in that. So really exciting. But also the Wallop Fund also helped to provide a lot of the support for my own field research to carry on some of the work that I was doing. And as Dr. Anderson mentioned, it was work on examining continued social and economic deprivation in some of the most isolated, they call them interface areas in the cities, particularly in Northern Ireland, in places like Belfast and Derry. And how that's impacted the presence of this ongoing marginalization and deprivation has impacted efforts to try to build better relations, reconciliation, and the foundations for stable peace and democracy between communities of Catholic nationalists and Protestant unionists that have been historically divided by decades of violence in Northern Ireland. And just really generally, with the support of the Wallop Fellowship, I was able to carry out over 50 interviews with politicians, academics, former combatants, members of civil society and local community leaders to try to get some new perspective on what is the impact of deprivation. And what I found was pretty troubling, actually. What I found was in a lot of the most deprived areas, there's a real sense within those communities of basically having been left behind by the peace process of the late 90s, the Belfast Agreement or the Good Friday Agreement, feeling that essentially their life hasn't changed and the peace hasn't paid any dividends for them, which is always something that's really troubling and worrying. And what you see is in those areas, these most deprived areas, there's still the presence of low-intensity rioting on the regular, a lot of other violent antisocial behavior, and levels of prejudice, sectarianism, distrust, and segregation all remain really, really high. And a lot of people, including myself, would point towards this as one of the reasons behind the recent collapse of the Northern Irish government. If you're not up on Northern Irish politics, this has happened. The government isn't functioning, and so they're actually looking at a return to direct British rule for the first time since the peace process. So that's really big, Brexit, blah, 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 right? All of that stuff in the background. But also what I found, and maybe the most troubling, was it's these deprived areas that are providing the support and recruitment among youths that grew up post-peace process into dissident paramilitary groups. So groups that are opposed to the peace process, and so these are the areas that are the hotbeds for support and recruitment, both monetarily and in terms of youth joining these groups. So really important stuff. The findings from the work that I did with the support of the Wallop is going to go towards an article, a book project that I'm working on right now, looking at these issues of deprivation, and also with some of the work I'm going to continue doing with the Mitchell, hopefully towards some of the actual policy debates in Northern Ireland about how these things need to be addressed if we're going to move towards sustainable peace and democracy. So thank you so much to CGS, and thank you so much to the Senator Malcolm Wallop Fund as well. Cheers.
My shoe was untied, sorry. It's still untied, but I won't fall. So I'm Torsten Janos. I'm an associate professor in the economics department. I mostly do work in economic development economics, and I also do some international finance. Most of my research focuses on the economics of conflict and civil wars, with a secondary focus on democratic transitions and political stability. And my international finance research is mostly about financial crisis. I guess I'm kind of interested in sort of like crisis type situations. I greatly appreciate the grant I was able to receive from the Wallop grant, which allowed me to hire a really good research assistant that I've been working on with the past year. And we're getting close to done with the project. Our project studies the effect of economic growth, national income fluctuations, economic factors, economic performance on political stability. And so we're asking whether countries that are in economic crisis, when countries go into economic crisis or perhaps they experience economic booms, are they more likely to change their political regimes to go into either from autocratic type systems to into democratic type systems, or from democracy into autocracy? Something we put a lot of weight on is in order to identify, distinguish causation from correlation in the data. We have this large data set of countries from, most of the data is from the 1970s, well, the data set we use is mostly from 1973 to ballpark 2010. And one challenge is that a lot of times countries go through instability periods where maybe the economy isn't doing so well, and then you can also have political regime changes. However, it's difficult to know if the political instability is causing the economy to go into turmoil, or it's the economic turmoil that affects the political system. So what we do is we collect a data set of international commodity prices. So things like international gold prices and food prices and oil prices and different commodities, because those are kind of fixed by the world market and are beyond the control of individual countries. And we ask what happens when those prices go up and down. That affects, because a lot of countries are heavily commodity dependent, because they depend on a few commodities. So they might be exporting like copper or tin or something like that, or like a few commodities. And so we look at how those globally introduced international market fluctuations affect political stability. We seem to find a pattern that economic crises do undermine autocratic regimes. It's particularly regimes. There's a difference between different regime types. So the autocratic regimes that are based on either a personal kind of dictator or personal leader, or party-based regime, they tend to be very susceptible to economic declines. So, which may be because they're kind of legitimizing themselves based on delivering economic growth. So a country like China, for example, if they don't continue to deliver economic growth, people might start to rise up against them. In Indonesia in the late 1990s, when the economy went into a crisis, people toppled the Suharto regime. During the Arab Spring as well, the Arab Spring economies, they had been stagnating for a long time because of poor management and corruption. And eventually that may have contributed to why people rose up against them. A lot of youth were unemployed, a lot of people are unemployed, and eventually you get mad at the regime. So we find that most of the autocratic regime are vulnerable to economic crisis, downturns. There are a few regimes, which maybe especially seem to be military regimes, that actually they are more resilient, but military regimes seem to be able to democratize when the economy is doing well. That's when they're more likely to democratize. And we're thinking it may be because they're less susceptible to popular pressure, like mass demonstrations and stuff, because they actually control the use of force. And so they may be able to choose their exit. So they may choose to exit in good times, because then it's, you want to leave with a good legacy. You're less likely to maybe be prosecuted, and you may be able to escape, in good times. So that we kind of find that. As I can say one more thing. Also, the countries that are most prone, the autocratic regime that are most prone to fall, the dictators more likely to fall, are countries with a history of instability, that have had political instability in the past, kind of, and that have weak constraints on executive power. So governments that aren't where the president is extremely powerful. So countries with kind of like badly institutionalized regimes. And those are the ones that are most prone to fall during economic crisis. So that's kind of what we're at, and we don't see that much evidence that economic crisis topple democracies. It's relatively rare for democratic regimes to go back into autocracy, like what we call democratic backsliding. It does happen, like we've seen in Venezuela, for example, or in Russia, and some of it does in Turkey right now. It does happen that countries go from democratic to being less democratic, but we don't find a strong connection with economic crisis in the data, and so it may be a statistical issue, because since the events are rare, it's hard to find statistically significant effects. And so the correlations are negative. Economic crises are negatively correlated with the chance that democracy survive. So it's probably not good for democratic survival. But in terms of statistical significance, it's a little bit harder to make strong conclusions. So that's all I had. Thank you.
Hello, so, excuse me, my name is Robert Field. I'm the Associate Director for the Centre for Global Studies. It's my pleasure to introduce our Wallop Student Fellows. Lindsay Hine from Pennsylvania, Jerry Scott from Green River, Wyoming, and Cameron Green from Cheyenne, Wyoming. So what we're going to see from our students is how Wallop funding has helped them engage in international problems and perform research, not only to help support their education, but actually to make a difference in the world. So you're going to see 3 10-minute presentations, and bear in mind, a 10-minute presentation is really hard to prepare, so we're going to see how well they stick to time. And so what we're going to do is enjoy a journey together to Moldova, Georgia, France and Cambodia while we address some complex social, environmental and cultural issues. And with that said, I'm going to pass on to Lindsay. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Lindsay Hine and I'm a master's student in the International Studies program here at the University of Wyoming. Today I'm going to be talking to you about my thesis research, which is on access to education for Roma girls in Moldova. So to give a little background on why I decided to do this project, I am really interested in access to education across the globe, but particularly in areas which are sort of off the radar, that are neglected. I think one of these is Eastern Europe. You know, when we think of Europe, we think of, you know, the Eiffel Tower, the London Bridge. We don't necessarily see this. The people that I talk to are really struggling with access to education, and here's just one example of you know, you have to make a decision between sending your child to school and putting food on the table. I'm going to give a brief background on Moldova and Roma. Then I'm going to talk about my research questions and my research design. And finally, I'll wrap up by giving some general findings and larger impacts that I think can come from this research. So Moldova is here. It's this small country between Romania and Ukraine. It's a former Soviet state. It gained independence in 1991 for the first time in its existence ever. It's the poorest country in Europe with an average income of only around $3,400. It's had a very rocky transition towards democracy with conflict here and there, but there's, you know, a general trend of moving towards the EU and democratization. Moldova is also part of the European neighborhood, so it's all these countries in orange here, which sort of surround the EU. And while these countries aren't members of the European Union, they still have, you know, similar policies and are trying to implement similar democratic measures. Roma are the largest ethnic group in Europe. The population is around 10 to 12 million. They're all over the continent. They have this deep history of marginalization. They were a nomadic people from northern India that came to Eastern Europe in around the 4th century. They were enslaved. The picture on this slide is actually a poster from a Romani slave auction in the 1830s in Romania. They were liberated in the 1860s, but then had to face discrimination and cleansing during the Holocaust just a few decades later. They continue to face marginalization in the different countries across Europe. In Moldova in particular, 50% of Roma live in extreme poverty. I decided to, again, focus on Roma women in particular. They're even more marginalized than Roma boys and non-Roma peers. They have a very unequal access to education with, you know, 45% of women not having any sort of formal studies compared to 33% of Roma men and 2% of non-Roma women. As part of the European neighborhood policy that I sort of talked about earlier, Moldova got involved in this decade of Roma inclusion, which took place all over the EU. They implemented a 4-year action plan on Roma inclusion to let them have better access to institutions like schools, hospitals, and those sort of things. They're currently on their 3rd 4-year term of this 4-year action plan. Again, the policy is designed to ensure cultural and social rights of the Roma population, and again, making sure that there's equal access to education, healthcare, and other institutions. So now that I've given some background, my research was primarily focused on, was this policy working? I wanted to talk to people on the ground, Roma girls and their parents, and also policymakers and community members who would be impacted by this policy. I also wanted to see what barriers stood in front of girls and their Roma girls in access to education, and also what facilitated access to education. Finally, I wanted to see how the multiple identities, i.e. being, a Roma and a girl, impacted their access to education and their academic careers. So with that, I went to Chisinau, Moldova in May and stayed there until mid-July. I conducted 20 interviews and 3 focus groups, like the one pictured on this slide, where I got to talk to Roma girls and their parents, in one setting at one time to see how they interacted. I also spoke to other key stakeholders, such as international organizations, local NGOs, policymakers, Roma leadership, and community mediators. That's one group that I really want to highlight, is the community mediators. So they are state employees now because of the inclusion policy, and their job is to create a bridge between their local communities and the Moldovan government. So what I found was that the policy is largely ineffective in addressing the needs of Roma girls. Like I said before, there's some challenges in democratization that come from implementing these new sorts of policies. Many of the Roma that I spoke with said that, this policy is just a piece of paper. It's not really doing anything because there's no funding to monitor, evaluate, or, actually really get on the ground and implement this policy. Another thing was that it was more culturally sensitive, in the sense that Roma are becoming more and more included in the policy-making process. However, none of these Roma are Roma women, so they don't address the needs that Roma women have. One example of that is that the policy doesn't talk about gender-specific issues in the minority culture, such as early marriage, which is really common in Roma culture, where Roma girls are pulled out, when they hit puberty because their parents are afraid that they will lose their virginity, which is, the defining characteristic of their personhood. However, the good news is that access to education seems to be more and more facilitated by female community mediators. They're doing a really great job of talking to their local communities and getting people excited about education. They also do a really great job of mediating those times when, a girl wants to go away to the city for university, but her parents are really scared of helping or letting her go. These community mediators are also assisted by a group of informal group of female role models who are about, my age, and they're girls that have gone to university farther and farther away from their rural villages, and what they do is they come back and they say, look, I have this great education, but I've still kept my values. I still dress the same. I still have the same traditions. So I think as far as the larger impacts of my research, it shows that it's important to make policy which isn't only sensitive to culture, but also sensitive to gender as well. Time and again, research has shown that access to education can facilitate women who are more politically active, who are better educated, have better educated children, and have better overall health. And I think it's also important to continue women's engagement in the policymaking and implementation process. The Roma community mediators that I mentioned before are only in a few, distinct villages, but I think that they're doing such great work that if that model was replicated all over the country, it could really make a difference. So with that, I would like to give a special thank you to the U.S. Senator Malcolm Wallop Fund for Conversations in Democracy in partnership with the Center for Global Studies. I also want to thank my thesis committee, especially my chair, Dr. Zoe Pearson. With that, I would like to hand it over to Jerry, who's also going to talk about his experience in a post-Soviet state. Thank you.
Does the EU, their EU neighborhood, does the EU Kendi? We are going to try to do a group question.
Yeah, sorry, my apologies for that. I should have announced that earlier. We're going to take Q&A at the end, so we're going to encourage all of our speakers to maybe just sit up at the front, and then we can take questions as one group, because you're going to see these linked together, some of the questions. So, sorry about that.
Yeah, it's fascinating, the neighborhood thing. I'm totally on board with you. Cool. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Jerry Stott. I'm an MA candidate in public administration at the great University of Wyoming in our wonderful square state. My experience here is a little bit different than what my colleagues had. Where Cameron and Lindsay were doing research, I went over to Europe to do some very practical things that were necessary in my education. I went over for an internship, and this internship placed me with the Ministry of Environment, which I'll get into a little bit more on that structure and my experience. Oh, sorry. I got to pretend like this is karaoke and got to get really up in here. There's some Barry Manilow coming afterwards. So I'm a 2011 graduate from Green River High School. After that, I went to community college in Powell, Wyoming. I continued my education by coming down here to Laramie, where I got my political science undergraduate degree, and then I'm currently working on my public administration degree, like I just mentioned. And I'm hopefully going to graduate in 2018, knock on wood, that everything goes all right. But as you can see, I spent a lot of my time in Wyoming. Almost all of my education from the time that I was born until this past year was in Wyoming at different places. And that led up to, well, I need to get this experience to really take me somewhere else and get another viewpoint, especially when it comes to administrative bureaucracy. Wyoming has a certain culture, Colorado has a certain culture, but America has an inherent culture in their bureaucracy. We know that. And I wanted to get a different look and something that would really give me a comparison. So I went to the Republic of Georgia. And with this, I was there for I was there for 8 weeks this summer, 2 months, and I had a blast. As you can see here, this is some pictures that I had. Not only did we have fun, I spent my birthday over there, and there were some lovely people, but I also got to make friends and actually make an impact, which is one of the best things about this project, is I got to help the Republic of Georgia out in some facet, which is way better than just getting coffee over in Cheyenne. So my internship lasted for 2 months, like I said. I was gone from about June 10 to August 10, and that was a really great time for me. I was able to see Georgia, see the nation and also see the region, but also make an impact. Some of the things that I was working on, the two major projects, one of which was a little bit more boring, but it was actually the thing I found the most interesting, was a risk management policy. For those of you who might not know what a risk management policy is, it's one of those things that looks at what risks are we taking, both financially and with our personnel. Everything from, are we spending too much money on NGOs, or are we trying to make partnerships that shouldn't be made, to are people getting finger cuts because they have too much paperwork on their hands? How can we mitigate this, and how can we really improve the ministry? And this is something that came along because in 2012, the Republic of Georgia's parliament passed a piece of legislation that mandated each ministry, there's about 18, each ministry over there adopts a risk management policy, in turn also creating some internal auditing departments. So it's really fascinating what was going on there. And this was the first one in Georgia, and I was able to work on that and create it. I basically had a desk and some time and some research and a lot of resources to try and figure this out. And it was baptism by fire, but it worked. By the time I left, Georgia had their first ever federal level risk management policy. So that was really neat. Another great thing that I was able to do was work on the recycling program. Several years ago, the EU friends, the friendship, that kind of orange band that you saw in Lindsay's presentation, they got together and decided there's certain things that we needed to make, certain milestones, and one of those is recycling. We needed to fix this. Tbilisi, Georgia, which I'll show you a map here in a second, Tbilisi, Georgia had a really big littering problem, and they wanted to institute this recycling program. All of this leads up to having a really strong bureaucratic system, but also a really safe and a better environment for the Georgian people. And so I got to help work on that too. But I also did some other things too. When you're an intern at a bureaucracy, you're of course going to help with facilitating some conversation between departments. Between NGOs, I got to work on some international work too, trying to help with the way that they worded things and trying to really facilitate and use my experience as a student here in public administration for their administrative sector. Also, I made a lot of friends. That's something I was going to put up there too, that I couldn't leave without. Tbilisi, Georgia is a former Soviet state. As Lindsay mentioned, it is right about there. And as you can see, it's at a really strategic point. The United States has a lot vested in this. Not only are they a border state with Russia, they're also bordering Turkey, and they're on the Black Sea. So there's a lot going on right there geopolitically. Tbilisi is located right in the middle. It's on a river, where Georgia has a population of about 4.9 million. Tbilisi had a population of about 2 million. So again, coming from Wyoming, this is totally different than anything I've experienced. I was in a city that had had numerous people in it, way more than Wyoming, about 4 times as many. So that was a total culture shift that was great for me. I got to ride public transit for the first time, and it was great. They didn't have air conditioning, but it was great. So like I said, their population is quite a bit more than Wyoming, 1.5, 1.2, depending on where you draw the borders there for the city. The demographic is most of the people there were Eastern Orthodox. When you rode in a cab, when you rode in a bus, you'd see a lot of crosses, which really impacted the way that they felt. There's a lot of tradition there that, especially with the environment, kind of made it hard to spend money in places that weren't necessarily related to their culture. About 10% of the population were Muslim. There's a lot of tourism from Iran and Iraq and some of those different places, especially Turkey. And as far as their monetary situation goes, they have their annual GDP is about 37 billion. Wyoming's is about 35 billion, to put that in perspective. And the Ministry of Environment had a grand total budget of $15 million. That's about like Laramie Police Department. To put that in the grand scope of things, their Ministry of Defense had a $660 million budget. So the Ministry of Environment was not doing well. Part of the reason why it was necessary to do that risk management policy was because they don't have the money to spend on things, but they needed to form that connection and ensure other people that they were easy to work with when they were getting funding from the EU, when they were getting funding from NATO, when they were getting funding from all these other places that were going to try and help them. They needed to prove that they were easy to work with. So that's one of the neat things about being over there, is I can help with that. Like I said, they're a former Soviet state. A lot of people don't know this, but Joseph Stalin was born there. They, being a Soviet state, were really wrapped up in something that was nowhere near democracy. They were subject to a lot of rule that was coming out of Moscow. This kind of led up to the 90s when, of course, in 1991 they left, along with Moldova and a couple other states. They left the former Soviet Union, and this led to a lot of turmoil. The 1990s led to a lot of corruption in the government, a lot of corruption in the bureaucracy, and a lot of just unsafe places to be. But in 2003, this reached an apex of the Rose Revolution, which is where the former corruption was challenged by the people in a very peaceful way, thus the rose as a symbol of peace. And in 2003, they were able to have a fair election of a president named Saakashvili, who then took over and kind of really restructured the bureaucracy and had a really firm hand in making sure the bureaucratic process helped the democratic process. And now it's one of the safest places. You go to the different travel places online, you can type it in, you'll see that it's almost in the top 10 or top 15 as far as safest countries to go, which is a big change from the 1990s. Part of this is a partnership with the United States. The United States has a lot vested in this, not just geopolitically, but also making sure that we have friends overseas. The really interesting thing here is most of the time when we go over to another country and try to instate a democracy, it doesn't work. We've seen it fall apart in certain places, especially like Lindsay was talking. There's a lot of policies there that we would like to see that just don't end up getting rolling. There's a few things that we did in Georgia that were a little different. One is creating JIPA, which stands for the Georgian Institute for Public Affairs. This was a whole university for students like me over in Georgia to go and learn how to be bureaucrats, how to be economists, how to run this new democracy. And that led to a lot of people working in the ministry. The Ministry of Environment, which I have shown down in the bottom there, is where I worked. That had a lot of people in it who were current students or were former students. My boss was a former student. My coworkers were former students or were current students. And then the minister himself was a former professor at JIPA. And then the president, the last president they had was also a former lecturer at JIPA. So they have a very strong connection to this, which was funded by USAID in the 1990s. The ministry is also in partner with USAID, so they get a lot of funding that way. The recycling program I mentioned was tied up with that. The buildings you see on the left over here are from when Mike Pence came to visit. There's a military partnership that we do with them. Mike Pence came, got to see his little convoy drive through. That was really exciting. But it also showed that the Georgians actually appreciate what we've done over there. They have a street named after George W. Bush and a statue of Ronald Reagan. They really appreciate what America has been able to do for them. This is a picture I wanted to show you that shows the tight-knit connection between Georgia and the students at JIPA. In white are the students, in red are the parliament, some members of parliament who played soccer against them when I first got there. The middle person, let's see if I can work this. This person right here in red is a former Real Madrid player, which means that the JIPA students lost by quite a bit. They were pretty bad. But it was really fun to see the interaction between people who are parliament, the policymakers, and the people who will eventually end up implementing this policy in the bureaucracies. The next picture I have here is from the day that the USAID got together and we had a celebration about this recycling project that got going. This is from one of their major news stations, and if you see in the back, there's a long beard and a hobbit-looking guy. That's me. I was in the background there in this, and it was really exciting to be a part of it. They had news people all over the place. This is one of the promotional things from that day. These are the recycling bins they ended up putting up around town to try and facilitate some of the recycling that they wanted to have happen. And of course, that's me. This is a structure of the bureaucracy. Do not, oh goodness, you go back. Do not worry about this green arrow. It looks like a flow chart. That's not what it is. That green arrow is to point out where I was in this structure. As you can see, there's one minister, 3 deputy ministers, and one section of departments that has no deputy minister. I was right there at the top. That meant that there was a lot of transparency from what I was doing on the risk management policy and the minister himself, what I was doing with communication and the minister, which meant if I messed up, I was in trouble, so I tried not to mess up. But as you can see, they have a pretty good little structure here, and they get quite a bit done for what they do. Like I said, they don't have a very big budget, but it's really fun to be a part of that. And overall, it was a great opportunity for me to not only impact their democracy in a way of facilitating some sort of communication, but also creating policy. But I got a whole lot out of it. That was baptism by fire on a lot of different levels, and it was an amazing thing that I never would have been able to do if it weren't for the Malcolm Wall Fund for Conversations in Democracy. So thank you so much to all the people who've been able to help me get there, and thank you so much to all of you for being here. Now I'd like to welcome up Cameron Green. He's going to talk about some of the research he's done that's super fascinating, and it's a little bit better than bureaucratic research.
These are hard presentations to follow up. So my name is Cameron Green, and I am from Cheyenne, Wyoming. I'm a second-year MA candidate in the history department here at the university. And I'm here to talk about my thesis research, which is about French representations of Cambodian identity during the colonial period, 1863 to 1931. Majority of my research deals with silent films, World's Fairs, and museums, and I consider those mediums in relation to the concepts of identity, memory, and economics. In my thesis, I argue that French fantasy, fetish, and romance of Khmerness created boundaries and limits through which Cambodia, France, and the world racially identify Cambodian bodies. While this is a history project, there's still relevance for it today. French representations continue to affect and shape Cambodian identity, and Cambodia serves as a good case study to show context for post-colonial societies and emerging national identities. Cambodia was established as a part of colonial French Indochina in 1863. Indochina was an important part of the French Empire because it helped them both economically and culturally divide the British influence in the region. As we can see here, Cambodia is located in between Vietnam and Thailand on the Southeast Asian Peninsula. And Cambodia was a big part of the Indo-Chinese mission because for cultural reasons and economic reasons, when traders would stop on their way to China, they would have to stop at the port city of Phnom Penh in Cambodia. Angkor Wat was the center of French romance and fantasy in Cambodia, built in the 13th century by King Suriwariman II. Angkor Wat is unlike any other temple site in the Angkor complex. Instead of facing east, it faces west, and it's also dedicated to the god Vishnu, which is unlike other Hindu temples in the region. For Angkor Wat, the walls of Angkor Wat depict the Riyamaker, and the Riyamaker is a Cambodian epic poem of good versus evil, and it's a retelling of the Hindu poem, the Ramavada. When French explorer Henri Mohawk first found Angkor Wat, he was walking through the temples and he was amazed by these images that he saw, and he didn't believe that the Cambodians could build such a thing, because at the time the French thought that the Cambodians were lazy, docile, and rude, and so they believed that some ancient civilization must have built them. And because of the way that some of the depictions were, it made him think, he associated them with the Egyptians. And so it reminded him of Egyptian hieroglyphs at the Great Pyramids in Egypt. And he thought that maybe this could be the lost tribe of Israel that made these. And he soon, once he thought of that, he went door to door throughout Phnom Penh and Siem Reap looking for Jews in the country, and he could never find them, obviously. And so this is an important part because this talks about like, the fantasy and the romance and how it kind of gets started in the region. For 6 weeks this summer, I had the opportunity to travel the world. I spent time in Paris and in Phnom Penh, and these are the questions I took with me. How did the French view Cambodians in relation to French colonial goals in Southeast Asia? What images did the French use to represent Cambodia and Cambodians? And what were the consequences of French colonialism in Cambodia? For 2 of those 4 weeks, I spent time in Paris, France. I started my research at the Musée Guimet, which is the National Asian Art Museum in France. I spent time at La Cinemateca, which is a film archive. It has films from the beginning of the French film industry all the way to contemporary time. And the Quai Branly, which is home to the 1931 Colonial Exposition collection that prominently featured Angkor Wat at the center of the attractions. And finally, I spent 4 weeks in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. There, I was able to view silent films about Cambodia at the Bopana Audio and Visual Resource Center. It's a central place to view those films. I had a chance to visit the National Archive of Cambodia and conduct weeks and weeks of research, going through old files from the 19th century, which was very cool. And finally, I got to visit the National Museum of Cambodia, which was established by the French in 1922 as part of their colonial mission to talk about the culture and instill some kind of fundamental civilization in Indochina. I want to turn our direction to this image here. This is an image of the sculpture court at the Albert Sarraut Museum. That's the National Museum in 1922. This image was taken by Georges Grullier. He was the first director of the museum. Grullier was the first European-born in Phnom Penh, so he kind of has a little bit of significance to the area. In this image, it doesn't appear like there's any rhyme or reason for the way that these sculptures are organized, and because not one sculpture particularly stands out among the rest. But because not one sculpture stands out, suggests that this is something educational. This was meant to teach people traveling through Cambodia and through Indochina something about Khmer-ness, something about Khmer art. And so that's why this image is so significant, because it does tell us like how were the French portraying Cambodians during the colonial period. This image I didn't think existed. When I first had emailed the archive in Cambodia, they told me, this item doesn't exist. We don't have photographs of the original exhibit displays, and we don't have exhibit layouts of the original exhibits. But I soon found out that archive that I emailed was the wrong archive. And so I ended up at this archive, kind of on mistake. My tuk-tuk driver was just like, oh yeah, I'll take you to the archive, and we ended up here. But luckily that happened, because I was able to find these great materials there. I found 5 other photos that are able to paint a broader picture of how they were portraying Cambodians. I want to go to a set of images now to kind of talk about how French portrayals of Cambodians have moved on throughout time to contemporary building of their identity. Dance and music have always been a big part of Cambodian identity. And early on, when the French first arrived, Cambodians were being taught how to dance at the royal palace. The thing that happened, though, is that the French architects took Cambodian dance out of a traditional space of the royal palace and out of a traditional space of performance and placed it into a colonial setting and placed it into the view of the world. And this photo here was taken in 1926 by our friend Georges Grullier. And he is, at this time, the director of the Fine Arts School. The Fine Arts School was established in 1926 in order to prepare Cambodians to do 2 things. One, to go to the 1931 World's Fair in Paris to exhibit their culture for the whole world to see in comparison to other empires. And 2, it was to somehow give them a sense of their heritage and a sense of the Khmer civilization. And a lot of these objects that were made at the Fine Arts Schools were later sold at the gift shop at the National Museum. So this image here displays one of the many Cambodian dances from Apsara. On the right-hand side, we have one of the demons from Cambodian mythology, and on the left-hand side, we can see a Cambodian dancer performing traditional Cambodian dance moves that kind of do look like the Egyptian dance moves, but they're their own thing. The next two images here show Cambodian dance in contemporary times. The first image is from the Raffles Hotel. The Raffles Hotel is a reminder of French colonialism throughout the region. And some of the contemporaries that have visited this hotel recently were Jacqueline Kennedy and Michelle Obama have both stayed at this hotel. This hotel primarily caters to Western guests, and so we can see the Cambodians performing these dances outside of a traditional space and in the space of a tourist type of arena. When we look at the last photo here, this last photo is a celebration of traditional Cambodian dance, but it's also a tourist thing as well. This image is of Cambodian living arts, which was started by Arn Trong Pong. Arn Trong Pong, his family owned the only opera house in Phnom Penh. When the Khmer Rouge took over Phnom Penh in 1975, his whole family was killed off, along with 90% of Cambodia's cultural and intellectual leadership. When he returned to Cambodia, he opened this school in order to teach Cambodians through traditional dance and music. And these students go on later to have careers either in the tourist industry or at the Royal Palace as dancers, because dance is still a huge part of their identity. And finally, I want to conclude with one last image of Angkor Wat. This is an image I took at sunrise at Angkor Wat. And it's literally impossible to see the temple from where I'm standing, even though I'm maybe like 200 yards away from it. And this is because there's so many people still coming to Cambodia and wanting to see Angkor Wat because it continues to resonate with people today, both from the West and from China and Singapore. So there's many tourists that still come to visit these temples. And finally, I'd like to thank the Senator Malcolm Wallop Fellowship for Conversations on Democracy in partnership with Center for Global Studies, and my graduate committee, especially my committee chair, Dr. Isadora Helfgott. So, as they say in Cambodian, Akun Karna. Thank you.
So with that, I'd like to thank all of the speakers, faculty speakers and student speakers, and obviously the Wallops for the funding for this wonderful research that you've seen today. So we're going to now have an informal Q&A session without recording. So